Good afternoon again, everyone. This is Janet Peace. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Business Strategy here at C2ES. We're very pleased to welcome you for today's webinar on putting a price on it, global leadership on carbon pricing. You know, at C2ES, and even when we were the Pew Center, we have long supported market-based approaches to addressing climate change because we think it's a critical and cost-effective policy option, and it can really help us with our deep decarbonization strategies that we know we need. It's since we started on this topic, the number of carbon pricing programs around the world has really increased. And a recent World Bank report found that, there's 57 carbon pricing programs have been implemented or will be implemented this year. And we have a speaker today who's going to talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But it's important to note that even though we have 57 programs right now, they only cover about a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions. And really, only about 5% of those programs are priced at levels that are consistent with meeting our commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. Nevertheless, you have to admit, it's a step in the right direction, but we need more. We need to expand carbon pricing programs, and the prices are going to have to increase over time to really be effective and delivering innovation and investment and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But enough about that. We really are happy to be joined today by three leading experts on carbon pricing. We'll begin with Thomas Erb, who's going to give us an overview of the state and trends of carbon pricing around the world. Tom is a partner relations coordinator at the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition at the World Bank, CPLC for short, who's really done some amazing work on carbon pricing globally. And then we're going to turn to Jos Delbeke, who's going to share with us the lessons learned from one of the earliest carbon pricing programs, the EU emissions trading system. Jos previously oversaw the EU ETS program when he was the Director General of the European Commission's Directorate General Climate Action since its creation in 2010 until 2018. Jos is a senior advisor at the European Political Strategy Center. I always think of Jos as kind of the founder, father, if you will, of the EU ETS. So we're really lucky to have him. And then we're going to wrap things up with Henk Sa, who's going to talk about the newest carbon pricing program in South Africa. It went into effect last month, and it's the first carbon tax in Africa. So we're going to see how it's going. Hasn't been in operation very long, but let's hear what Henk has to say about that. He's really a leading expert on climate change mitigation in South Africa, and he's a partner at Ecometrix Africa. So again, great to have all of you on this webinar today, and following your presentations, we're going to invite questions from our listeners. So folks, make sure to submit your questions using the GoToWebinar question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So without further ado, I think probably a lot of you have tuned into our C2ES webinars in the past, but just 1 second so you know who we are. I mean, we're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan think tank, and we often try to bring diverse interests together to find practical solutions. And we really think it's important for folks to work together, really now more than ever, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deploy innovation and clean energy and really prepare for the impacts that we can't avoid anymore. So at the international level, we have been for years bringing together negotiators and private sector representatives on the international carbon markets provisions under Article 6 is where we're focused right now. I'm trying to get through and I want to get to our speakers, so I hope I'm not rushing too much. But at this point, let me turn it over to Tom so he can give an overview of this whole carbon pricing program globally. Tom, can you take it away?
Sure, thank you, Jeanette, appreciate it. So to start, I'd like to thank C2ES. Obviously, Janet outlined some of the leading work they're doing in this space, so thank you for that, but also for hosting this conversation today. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us, and of course, thank the audience for tuning in. I'm sure many of you are leading on both carbon pricing, but climate policy as well. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation later in the session. So what I'm going to do is provide an overview of where we're at with carbon pricing. Janet gave a good brief overview of where we're at, but I'm going to dive into a little bit of detail. And this is based on our annual State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report that we do each year. the latest of which was published in Singapore at the Innovate for Climate Summit. It was launched there. But if you're interested in diving a little deeper into any of the specific proposals, I highly recommend checking out that report. So if we can go to the next slide. So we're currently at 57 carbon pricing initiatives around the world. These are initiatives that have either been implemented or are scheduled for implementation. This is an increase from 51 in 2018, and they cover 46 national and 28 subnational jurisdictions across the world. A few examples include the carbon tax in Argentina, South Africa, and Singapore, and of course the federal carbon pricing backstop that has been implemented now in Canada. There's additional developments elsewhere, including in China, where you see them continuing to pilot subnationally their ETS and continue to move towards implementation, which is set for 2020. Next slide, please. So if we look at Canada, this is a place where there's been significant momentum just in the last year. As many of you know, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was adopted in June of 2018 and established the federal carbon pricing backstop system. So the basic summary here is Canada imposed carbon pricing across its entire federal jurisdiction. And the subnational entities, whether they're territories or provinces, are required to meet that benchmark. And there's basically three different buckets that these subnational entities fall with under. The first, such as British Columbia and Quebec, are entities that have had existing carbon pricing systems in place and met that benchmark and therefore allowed to continue implementing the existing system. Then you had those subnational entities that, to meet the benchmark, implemented new systems. So for example, Nova Scotia passed and implemented an ETS that launched in January 2019. And then you have others who have pushed back either through the label system or through other programs. For example, Ontario, who used to have a cap and trade program that was removed. And now you have the federal government imposing the federal backstop in Ontario and the other provinces that don't have their own systems. The federal backstop is a steadily rising carbon tax and includes returning the revenue back to households through income tax returns. Next slide, please. So some of the facts here you have from the last year, the coverage of greenhouse gas emissions under carbon pricing has remained the same. It's hovering around 1/5 or 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. On prices, we see significant variation between $1 and $127 per ton of CO2. We know from the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices report that we did in 2017 with Joseph Stiglitz and Lord Nicholas Stern, that prices should be in the range of $40 to $80 a ton of CO2 by 2020 and $50 to $100 a ton of CO2 by 2030 to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. There has been some progress. For example, you saw the Portugal carbon tax increase, basically almost doubling from around $8 to $14 per ton. Switzerland's carbon tax increased from about $85 per ton to $97. And then, of course, we're going to dive into this deeper, but the EU ETS, after some reforms, has gone up significantly as of late. Next slide, please. The basic summary here, though, is that prices remain too low to have a significant dent on emissions or to be in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Janet mentioned this earlier, but 51% of the emissions covered by carbon pricing systems are under $10 per ton, and only 5% of those emissions, so not even thinking about emissions that aren't priced, but just thinking about the emissions that are under a carbon pricing system, are covered by a price that are at Paris compatible levels. Next slide, please. Carbon revenues. So largely because of the increasing price under the EU ETS, we've seen revenues increase to 44 billion, and we've seen a steadily rise of about 11 billion per year since 2016. Next slide, please. These revenues have been used for a variety of different purposes. There certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all when it comes to carbon pricing revenues. In California, a vast majority of their revenues is used for climate-related projects. So these are investments that both further reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also have additional co-benefits. In Canada, at the federal level, you have redistribution back to households. So the dividend approach that many people are advocating for at the moment, such as Citizens Climate Lobby. British Columbia has had a little bit of an evolution in its carbon pricing system specific to revenues. It began as a pure revenue neutral legislation, specifically using revenue to offset income or to lower income taxes in order to offset increased energy prices. Now you're seeing them move towards more earmarking for green projects in addition to some of that income offset. Argentina is using its new carbon tax for a number of different uses, including the National Housing Fund, the Transport Infrastructure Fund, the Social Security System, and more. And then Ireland, which just announced a new climate action campaign with a more ambitious carbon price. So the conversation over revenue is going to continue, but to date, it's been primarily used for debt reduction. Next slide, please. So some of the trends that we're seeing, I'm just going to go through a few here because I know our time is limited, but first is learning by doing. So there's an increasing interest among jurisdictions to look both outside, externally at existing systems and lessons learned, but also internally through pilots to figure out how this carbon price could be implemented in practice and how it can be effectively managed and implemented. So for example, you have the ongoing pilots going on in China. You have Mexico beginning to start a pilot in 2020, and of course the EU ETS, who's gone under a number of reforms, ultimately strengthening it over time. 2, you have systems that may start small but increase, reassess, or improve over time. So the EU ETS is another good example of that, but also the South African example, the time it took to get that in place. California eventually going through some new changes and implementing those at the moment. Iceland's carbon tax increasing 10% as of January 1st, 2019, and set to increase another 10% in 2020. And then here in the US, more states looking to join RGGI are all examples of this. Third is the Paris Agreement drive in action. So in the last year, you've seen 8 additional parties, up to 96 parties now, put and mention carbon pricing in their nationally determined contributions. Another example of this is New Zealand moving forward with reforming and strengthening its ETS in order to align with its nationally determined contribution. So the idea here is as the Paris Agreement ramps up in ambition over time, you're going to see more interest in strengthening carbon pricing systems and using carbon pricing systems as a cost-effective way to meet those goals. 3 specific examples or trends that we're seeing a focus is definitely political economy, stakeholder engagement, and revenue use. Of course, these are all related, but in the last year, we've seen an increasing interest in the importance of making sure there's public support for carbon pricing systems, right? Because we know as carbon pricing is implemented, it's important for them to be durable and maintain that clear signal over time. So focusing on things like distributional impacts, how revenues can potentially drive additional benefits, build political coalitions, or reduce some of these distributional impacts, negative distributional impacts, is key, and also the importance of stakeholder engagement. So making sure very early on in the process, you're working with different key stakeholders to make sure they're involved and a part of the conversations. And then lastly, we've continued to see increased cooperation among governments, among different stakeholders on carbon pricing. So for example, the RGGI Transportation and Climate Initiative, looking at how that can be expanded. The European Union working with places like New Zealand, China, and California on strengthening ETS systems. And then other examples, advocacy platforms such as the Coalition of Finance Ministers that was launched in April here at the World Bank, and then the Carbon Pricing in the Americas Declaration as well. These are all things that are leading to additional alignment, additional collaboration among jurisdictions on carbon pricing. Next slide, please. So as we look around the world, there's continuous potential for more carbon pricing ambition at the international level. There's several things listed here, but something specifically to look at is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 is essentially the component of the Paris Agreement that allows parties to cooperate with one another using market-based mitigation mechanisms. So thinking about international carbon markets and how that relates to your nationally determined contributions. The rules are still being clarified. This is something that will be discussed heavily at COP25, but there's already pilots and research going on as far as how this could actually be implemented in practice. And it's really important because if a successful Article 6 could significantly reduce the cost of implementing some of these mitigation goals and increase climate finance around the world. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So something that this report went beyond, it went beyond its original focus on just explicit carbon pricing and looked at the implicit side, right? As we know, many policies outside of the explicit carbon tax, cap and trade system can put an implicit price on carbon. So this year, the report looked at 2 specific examples, which are fuel taxes, next slide, please, and fossil fuel subsidies. And there's some key findings or trends that came out of this. One is that it provides a more comprehensive view of countries' progress on carbon pricing to date. right? So if you have a better idea of not only your explicit system, but how other prices are putting a price on a carbon, you have a better idea of where you need to get with your own climate policies. It can help reach policy alignment. So for example, if you have mixed incentives where you have fossil fuel subsidies and carbon pricing in place, figuring out how and where you're at in the current situation and figure out how to align these can make you have a better policy package. And the next two are serving as an entry point to discuss explicit carbon pricing and providing useful lessons. So if you have political economy experience, you have technical expertise on implicit carbon pricing, it can ultimately help you with the explicit versions. So last slide, please. So to close up here, these are questions we all know, right? We know why we have to put a price on carbon. We know why we need to do it. We know how we can do it. We have experiences doing it. We know some of the roadblocks, but we also know we're not nearly where we need to be. Carbon pricing needs to drastically increase to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the question about what's next and how do we get there is a question I'm going to pass along to my fellow panelists. But I'm happy to talk about what the World Bank is doing, specifically through the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition and the PMR and other initiatives during the Q&A session. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the session.
Hey, thanks so much, Tom. I think that was a great overview, and I'm sure we'll come back to more about what the bank is doing because you have so many things going on. But let's turn now and hear from Jos. You know, the EU ETS has been operational now for many years. How's it going?
Well, thanks, Janet, and it is a real pleasure to participate in this conversation. I would like to concentrate my introduction on a few facts and figures, and then on the policy design of the EU ETS and how it evolved over time. So in the next slide, the overview of where we are in the EU, that is that we are reducing our emissions basically since 2005. And since 2005, a raft of policy measures were developed. One of the most important ones is the EU ETS. Today, historical figures, we are in 2018, 22% below 1990. We have a target of minus 40% by 2030, and that's a legally binding target. And there is quite a bit of discussion about the carbon neutral goal for 2050, carbon neutrality being a hot potato, and the new European Commission being installed those days take it high on its agenda. So it is quite likely that the EU goes for carbon neutrality by 2050. Next slide, please. Where did we reduce our emissions most? There are lots of figures on the screen, but if you concentrate on energy supply, energy use in manufacturing and industrial processes, and you look into the penultimate column, you see on index 1990 where we are today. For energy supply in 2017, we are 32% less. On energy use in manufacturing, we are 43% less, and indicator 57. On industrial processes, we are at indicator 73, which means 27% less. So these are the sectors covered by the EU ETS. The sectors not covered, look at transport, there the emissions go up. We have 120 in 2017, and even if we talk about international aviation, we have an indicator of 217, which is really quite a dramatic development. So energy and manufacturing, and next slide please, these are the sectors that are covered by the EU ETS. And in fact, when we translate the 40% target, the legally binding target for 2030, we have the most ambitious part to be delivered by emissions trading, which is 43% based on 2005 to be delivered by the power sector and by the manufacturing sector. So steel, cement, chemicals, companies like that, glass, pulp and paper, etc. The non-ETS, as we conveniently would call that, that is the ESR, that is the effort sharing regulation. This covers mainly small emitters, so as road transport, buildings, waste, agriculture, and these are not subject to the ETS. So emissions trading, 43%. Next slide, please. Now, what have we been doing under the ETS? Since 2005, when the system was developed, in 2005, 2018, we reduced the emissions with 29%. And these are validated historical figures. You see on the screen, we had to make a kind of correction at the top for the expanding scope of the ETS system, but basically minus 29% on less than 15 years. I think we will be able to say that by 2020, we will have reduced the emissions with more than 30%. And that is quite important. Of course, I have to add one thing. These are the emissions from the energy, the power, and the manufacturing industry, and they are also subject to other legislation in terms of waste recycling or renewable policy. Renewable energy has been stimulated quite a lot, but numerically, in terms of quantities, that is the minor part that was delivered in terms of emission reductions. The biggest part was due to the ETS. Next slide, please. But you know that the EU ETS was showing prices which were quite low for the period between 2012 and 2017. And that basically was a nightmare for us in the Commission, and that was due to two things. The Lehman Brothers crisis and the industrial recession related to it, where industrial activity went down and hence also energy production went down. And the other element was the influx of credits from the Clean Development Mechanism. And if you look at the next slide, please, then you see that on the credits that we were importing, and these are the yellow bars, the credits were going up very fast, and they counted for most of the surplus in the EU ETS by 2017. And so we had a real problem at hand, and that surplus needed to be stabilized because the price depressing effect was related to that surplus. And the surplus, as I said, half coming from reduced economic activity, half from the import of CDM credits that we were committed to under the Kyoto Protocol. In the next slide, please, you see that we created a market stability reserve. And the shaded area, or the dark red area, is the market stability reserve that starts operating as of now, 2018, 2019, and will, until 2023, stabilize the market by taking out the surplus out of the market. So that was a deliberate choice by the legislator to go for a quantity correction and not to go for a straight price correction. A price correction was simply not in the cards in Europe because the bickering about which price is the best one was a question we could not handle. But on the other side, we could discuss the nature of the surplus, the origin of the surplus, and we could take and create a reserve that you see on the screen in which the surplus is being stabilized. And in fact, the market was beating us because as soon as the decision was made on the market stability reserve, the prices went up. And over the last 12 months, prices are in the range of 25 to 30 euros. In fact, yesterday, the 30 euro benchmark was broken. And that is really an important element. And we reckon that this price level of minimum 25 euros per ton of CO2 is going to remain the minimum price level for years to come. Next slide, please. There is, however, an issue we had to address, and that is carbon leakage, or put it differently, the competitiveness pressures that this price level creates for our companies. And we are auctioning not more than 55% of the allowances. So 45% are giving out for free. And you see on the screen who is receiving those free allowances. This is mainly steel, chemicals, and cement. That is roughly 3/4 of the free allowances that are given. And I only have to mention the steel sector and the hard competition that was taking place in the steel sector over the last 5 to 10 years. So as to indicate the story that that was something we had to do, protect the competitiveness of our companies by giving them a fair share of free allowances. Now, I did not prepare a slide, but I heard the distribution issues of the revenues that Tom was mentioning. Now, on these revenues, they go to the member states, and the member states are committed to spend the revenues from the ETS in climate-related action. So most of that goes to innovation, but a considerable part is also going to investment programs to facilitate the low carbon transition. And what you see, and those who were in Katowice in Poland last year will have seen the results of that. That is that a lot of the revenues from ETS go to Poland, for example, because they have lots of coal-fired power stations, and lots of these revenues are used to facilitate the transition to the low carbon economy. And that was in Katowice, in Silesia, a really remarkable thing that happened, that on an old coal-fired power site, that we now had new activities such as a conference center, hotel facilities, and things like that. So I will stop my introductory comments there. Important to know is that the EU ETS has been the champion for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in Europe, and we were able at last to re-establish a decent price, which is hovering around 30 euros per ton for now, and may well stay in that range for the years to come. Thank you.
Great, Jos. And I mean, I'm so glad that both you and Tom mentioned the use of the revenues, because that's always a big question. How do you use these revenues? Does it improve the economic efficiency of the program? Does it help with the political viability? So I think we'll probably come back to that again. And with that, let me turn over to Henk. Do you want to take it away, Henk, and talk a little bit about what's going on with the South African carbon tax?
Yes, Janet, thank you, and thank C2ES and everybody for signing in. Yeah, the South African carbon tax. I thought before we actually go into the design and the impact of the tax itself, I'd take it a little step back and talk about South Africa's carbon footprint and its NDC, which is obviously the driver of this tax. Can we go to the next slide, please? So 2 components, a little bit background on South Africa and its emissions, and then the tax itself. Next slide, please. Next one. So this graph at the bottom shows what we call the peak plateau decline trajectory, and it's a bandwidth, and the upper limit basically says that South Africa's emissions intend to grow or are expected to grow until 2025, then they plateau until 2035, and then they decline towards 2050. If you look at the bars for 2010 and 12, those are the formally published carbon footprints of the country, and you see that the emissions have gone up, well, quite drastically actually, over 500 million tons of CO2, and this year we're getting close to 600 million tons, which also means it now breaches sort of the upper limit of the upward trajectory in the peak plateau decline trajectory, which obviously triggers a whole bunch of policy instruments that aim to curb down the country's emissions. If you think about South Africa's overall infrastructure, it is incredibly carbon intensive when it comes to all forms of energy. Pretty much all electricity is produced by relatively old coal-fired power stations. And as a result of the country's history, whereby it doesn't have any oil and for a long time was under a whole bunch of international embargoes, it doesn't have, it actually went the route of producing petrol and diesel from coal as well. So basically all energy forms in South Africa are very, very heavily coal dependent. And those two combined, which are mainly summarized in Eskom, the national utility, and Sasol, the national oil company, which together represent about 60 to 70% of the total country's emissions. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a timeline that combines both sort of the route to finally getting to the South African carbon tax and sort of South Africa's international commitments. It's obviously a signature to the UNFCCC. It ratified the Kyoto Protocol and more recently the Paris Agreement. I think the cornerstone of South Africa's climate policy is what they call the NCCRP, the National Climate Change Response Paper. And one of the components in that is the carbon tax. There are other aspects that other policies and incentives that are either under development, already been implemented in South Africa to curb its emissions. And for example, not the tax, but another program would be the REAP, which is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. Eskom, the national utility, is fortunate to be very close to monopoly. It produces electricity on an astronomically large scale at a very low price. Well, it used to. These prices are drastically increasing over time now, which made it a couple of years ago completely financially unviable to have any sort of renewable energy initiatives in the country, purely because the cost of that electricity would nowhere be competitive with the coal base. As such, they implemented this reprogram. There's a whole range of other incentives that are implemented with the aim to become more either energy efficient or cleaning up the energy, well, reducing the carbon intensity of the energy grid. And one of them is obviously the carbon tax that now was, well, I guess hailed just now as being the latest addition to a carbon pricing system in the world. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next one. Right, so after, well, I would say a decade of design and back and forth, the president signed the carbon tax itself into law in late May to start at from the 1st of June this year. In essence, it's a tax that starts at 120 rands, which, you know, on a good day represents about $8 to $9, and it basically targets large industry and direct emissions on site. Only scope 1 emissions are covered by the tax itself. One exception, although Eskom is technically, well, responsible for about half of the carbon footprint of the country, it is captured under the tax, but effectively exempted from paying any tax itself. There are a couple of good arguments for that. It's a state-owned entity. It doesn't react very well to market forces, and it actually is not in control when it comes to how it organizes its fuel mix. That is done from by the government itself. As such, a price signal wouldn't really work in that regard. Once you, as a company, as a taxable entity, have worked out what your direct emissions are, the tax bill explains to you how to do that, you are able to get a number of discounts on the amount of tax emissions you are paying tax over. The first one, and all taxable entities get those, is a 60% discount in the event your emissions are combustion based. And this is only for the first phase of the tax, which runs from the 1st of June this year till the end of 2022. If your emissions come from either fugitive or process emissions, then you get a 60 plus 10% discount for the first phase. Then there are 4 additional ways to reduce your total taxable volume. One is trade exposure. We'll talk a little bit about how those work just now. There's one related to the performance allowance, there's a budgeting allowance, and there's an offset allowance. Interesting to understand now is that although the tax has been signed into law, the regulations that govern how you can acquire those discounts from the trade exposure, performance allowance, budgeting, and offsets are still under development, which is obviously a little bit of uncertainty from a taxpayer's point of view, because the instruments you have to reduce your tax are still unknown, and you're already in a period over which you're going to pay tax. On practical terms, the first moment in time you actually have to pay the tax is middle of next year, from July. Next slide, please. So when we talk about these 4 discounts you can apply on your total taxable volume, the first one is the trade exposure allowance. Long story short, if you export more than 25% of the value of your total production, you're eligible to a discount on your taxable volume of up to 10%. The idea here is obviously to some extent compensate people for the loss in their international competitive position as a result of a tax, a cost that their international competitors might not have. The performance allowance, well, the idea is that it recognizes early action, and it sort of awards tax entities that outperform from a less carbon intensive production benchmark their peers in the sector. If you get an approved benchmark as a sector, and you as an entity in that sector can demonstrate that you outperform the benchmark, you get an additional 5% discount on the tax you pay. The carbon budget allowance, that's slightly more complicated in that you as a taxable entity deal with, when it comes to this tax, with well, first with National Treasury, and after that with the executing agency for tax, which is called SARS. But on the other hand, you also engage with the Department of Environmental Affairs when it comes to a process wherein the department tries to establish carbon budgets per sector and then per entity within that sector. If you participate on a voluntary basis in that process, the link to the carbon tax is that you get an additional 5% discount on the volume over which you are taxed. The last one, which is fundamentally different from the other discount, whereby you have to meet a certain profile to be eligible for a discount. The offset allowance basically allows you to, assuming they're eligible, and there's a whole, I guess, checklist and process to determine that, eligible carbon credits from internationally recognized standards like the CDM or the VCS, you can use those to offset up to 5 or up to 10, depending on which sector you are, of your emissions, and therefore pay no tax over the offset part of your emissions. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of an analysis on that offset part. Generally speaking, we expect that there's going to be about 500 entities in South Africa captured under the tax. Some of the rules around which carbon offsets are eligible can be quite complex, but basically they have to be from South Africa, they have to be outside of the tax net, and they have to meet certain timing criteria and not be on a specific negative list. If you look at the different sectors that are inside the tax net and therefore are potential buyers for these carbon credits, you basically end up with sort of on an annual basis a demand of close to 5 million tons in the first year. There is a provision whereby you can have old credits from South Africa be transferred and used as offsets against this demand. And obviously there's new supply that can be generated for a short period of time. That can be done from existing projects, but the main driver here from government is to have new projects developed in sectors outside of the tax net. Next slide, please. So how was the tax received? Yeah, I guess it was received the old-fashioned way. Industry was concerned about how expensive it was and how problematic it was for the profitability and potentially moving to other countries and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas governments, that's the energetic looking gentleman on the left corner, where government said, well, you know, if we look now at what the actual tax looks like for the first phase, we consider it rather weak and it won't have enough impact on behavior to contribute enough to our peak plateau decline trajectory. So we're gonna definitely beef it up for the next periods with higher rates, more or lesser discounts, and a couple of additional, well, tweaks to it so that the taxpayer, the incentive becomes stronger. This was then again obviously met by industry saying, well, that's not going too quickly and it's going to lead to an economic downturn. But I guess that's how these discussions always unfold. So that was my snapshot introduction to the South African carbon tax. Yeah, I'm looking forward to questions from your side. Back to you, Janet.
Excellent, Henk. Just so folks know where your perspective on this is coming from, could you just say like a little bit about the company you work for, Ecometrix?
Yeah, sure. So Ecometrix is a spin-off from, back in the day, Eco Securities, JP Morgan. At that stage, we developed mainly CDM projects in sub-Saharan Africa. With the collapse of the global market price for these CERs, we also branched out mainly into climate change related policy advice and to sort of climate positive technology transfers from the Western world to Africa. And as part of the policy advice side, we advise mainly at the private sector and within limitations government on, for example, the design of this carbon tax or the design of the offset regulations.
Very good. I was so impressed when we met in Johannesburg about the breadth of your knowledge on this topic. I'm so glad you could join us. So let me just kind of ask one question, and we've got a whole bunch of questions that have come in, but I want to throw one out there to begin with. You know, there's a number of other policies that all three of you have talked about. So it's not just carbon pricing, it's carbon pricing plus. When you think about the plus part, all of these complementary measures, is there any advice that you might have for policymakers? Here in the US, carbon pricing is really getting a lot of renewed interest. And I'd like to just hear from all three of you about the importance or concern about complementary measures. And since you've all talked about it, could you just all three kind of weigh in on what you think about these complementary measures and their value or not? Jos, maybe you could start.
Yes, I'm happy to start on that. There has been a long debate in Europe whether it was making sense to have, for the power sector, for example, an ETS, and at the same time renewable policy and energy efficiency measures and things like that. Now, as a policymaker, the line we took is to be very vigilant that all these different measures lead to the same result, namely carbon reductions, and that they do not run against each other. That is the most important advice, I would say, is what we were meticulously doing a follow-up on. Now, on the renewables, in the beginning, it costed a lot of money to drive renewables in the market. So I think that the ETS was taking care of all the emission reductions that were low priced. So the low-hanging fruit has really been taken by the ETS, while renewables, as it was a new policy, at that time very expensive. That has now changed, but at the time it was very expensive. So served another niche to drive a new technology into the market. Now that has been done. Renewable policy is now on par with conventional energy production. And now the carbon market in Europe, in particular on the prices we are seeing today, starts having an incredibly important influence in the energy sector. It encourages fuel switching away from coal towards gas and even towards renewables, because renewables are now really competitive. So gas has turned out to be the swing fuel, but the long-term way of investing in the power sector is definitely renewables, and definitely now encouraged to a large extent through the carbon price we are seeing today.
Very good. And Tom, you talked about the importance of complementary measures. I mean, there's folks out there, I hear this all the time, oh, the belts and suspenders are, keeping carbon price signals from being what they should be. Is that the experience with that you've seen as you look across the globe?
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation to be having, and a crucially pertinent question. And I'd say there's an ongoing debate about this, right? And I think we get a little bit caught up in the debate, at least here in the US, on the conversation of, do we need carbon pricing at all? It's kind of always on the extremes, right? Carbon pricing all we need is carbon pricing, which we know is not true, or we shouldn't have carbon pricing at all, which I don't think is a good argument either. But I also argue that there's not a lot of people making those arguments. I'd say there's a lot of compromise and interest in building these comprehensive climate packages. And how I'd summarize it is kind of in three ways. One, carbon pricing is absolutely key to a comprehensive climate package. Two, complementary policies are needed. So thinking about research and development, thinking about building codes, thinking about urban design to actually, if you have a price signal, actually working on giving people options to switch away from fossil fuel based lifestyles, things like just transition measures, all these things are critically important. So when you actually talk about pitching it, when you're thinking about a communications package or a political strategy, coming at it from this comprehensive climate package standpoint of like, yes, we're putting a price on carbon, but we're also doing all these other things that have additional benefits, or we're leading but of course we're also going to have a price on carbon to give that steady signal over time. So I think it's crucially important that we are in the right place on this conversation, instead of focusing solely on how can we design a perfect carbon tax, which is important. But the larger conversation is, what role does a carbon price play in this larger policy package so it can be complementary and we can increase ambition over time. So I think that's where the conversation is going, at least in the US. And then elsewhere, carbon pricing is used for a number of different reasons, right? Maybe primarily for emissions reductions, or it could be used for other things as well. So kind of hedging that conversation and setting the context with this idea that it's a part of a larger package, I think is important.
As here at C2ES, we often point to the fact that when you look at our changing climate, there are so many market failures. Consumers, producers, they have this, but economists call it asymmetric information. Somebody has better information than somebody else. And then when buildings, there's the owner versus the operator. And so the price signal doesn't actually get translated to the person who's living if they don't own the apartment, for example. So there's Oh, and even the spillover effects that come from, you know, technology development, R&D. There's just so many market failures. It's hard to address everything with just a price. At least that's our perspective. I mean, Henk, and South Africa, are you hearing that same conversation about complementary measures?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think I mentioned one example, the renewable energy, the REAP incentive. I always see it in two boxes, right? The carrot and the stick approach. Either you make people pay for the emissions they cause, or you reward people for the emissions they reduce. And I think it should be a combination.
Mm-hmm.
Also, partially because, as you say, Janet, you can't, not everything is a nail, therefore you can't always fix it with a hammer, right? For example, the energy sector here, because of its structure, because of it being government owned and almost a monopoly, a price signal won't be the answer. So it needs to come from somewhere else. So I think it's always good to have a mix of measures to achieve, as long as they go after the same objective and they don't cancel each other out. I think that's definitely the route to go. What I have seen in South Africa, which I worry about a little bit, is that if you go overboard on the number of measures and the complexity of these measures, the execution and administration of them for both the private sector and government becomes potentially problematic.
No, absolutely. You definitely do not want your policies to be going in opposite directions, so they kind of cancel each other out. Absolutely. Just thinking about that for a minute, all three of you have kind of lived through the startup. I mean, Tom, you've watched the startup all across the globe, and Jos, you lived through the startup of the EU ETS, and Henk, you know, it took a while for this carbon tax to actually get put into place. What advice would you have for policymakers here in the U.S.? I mean, what do you think the biggest challenge that had to be overcome to get these policies in place? And so, what advice would you have for policymakers in the U.S. at this point?
Well, Jos Delbeke here. If I would have to make one strong advice, that is to get started, and to get started even if prices are lower than what we know we should have as prices to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because getting started is, politically speaking, a huge task, because it requires lots of data, for example, that is not always available. So you have to create some time to establish the infrastructure that you need to have the carbon pricing system work. Now, just to pick up on the last conversation, I strongly agree that we need a combination of measures, but some of the people were asking us in Europe, why did you not cover the transport sector under your emissions trading system? And that was begging the question about whether we go for emissions trading or we go for taxes. And as you know, in Europe, technical regulations are very important for cars and vehicles and fuels, but there is a lot of taxation at the pump. When you fill up your tank, then you have to immediately pay a price, out of which 50–60% is taxes. So we thought the transport sector is already sufficiently highly taxed. It is not making any difference to bring it under the ETS as of now. Now, the perspective may change in the future, because decarbonizing totally the economy by 2050 is going to be a hell of a job, and we may have to bring the transport sector under the ETS. But my message would be, get started. And if the price to pay is to start with a few sectors only, look in your indice what is the most important sector. And one of the most important sectors is the power sector and manufacturing industry, and that is how we did it in Europe. Start with those sectors and start with building up the infrastructure. Do not bother about the price in the short term, but give yourself a bit of time to build up the price level over time.
Very good. Tom or Henk, do you want to weigh in on advice for U.S. policymakers who are starting to think? I mean, I'm talking at the federal level because, of course, we have 10 states, now 11, that actually have a price. But there is this conversation that is really ratcheting up at the federal level about carbon pricing. So Tom or Henk, do you have any advice?
Yeah, sure. I can. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I fully agree that what was said just now, the most important thing is get started. What I've seen from the South African tax, it took literally a decade from the initial design to actually it signing into law. Obviously, all of it stands and falls with political will. That's required, and I think that is easier to muster if you keep it simple and you don't try to go a full blanket approach with very high pricing to start with. That is just difficult to get through the political process. So starting relatively small and at a relatively low level, strategically, I think that's a good entry point. Once it's there, you can start tweaking it and expanding it. What I've seen in South Africa, another aspect to consider is that the tax here tried to accommodate everybody's concerns, which to a certain extent is justifiable. On the other hand, it also dragged out the process much longer than it should have, and it overcomplicated the system itself. And at the end of the day, I mean, you're never going to get to a point that a turkey is going to vote for Christmas, right? So you can maybe address some of the comments, but you never satisfy everybody in that process. So I would be cautious of that.
I think that's great advice. And Tom?
Yeah, there's a number of different things to put in this conversation. I think the comments already are very key. I'd also add about communication, the importance of a communication strategy. In December at COP24, the CPLC and the Partnership for Market Readiness released the Guide to Communicating Carbon Pricing, which is essentially a tool to help governments build strategic communications plans at the outset of their carbon pricing program. So when we start thinking about planning ahead for the long term around carbon pricing, it's also important to think about what's your stakeholder engagement strategy, how are you going to talk about carbon pricing with the public, how can you build a particular political coalition around this. So my message to policymakers would just be, don't think about communication right before you're ready to go, but actually think strategically about it when you first start thinking about carbon pricing. And I think that guide's a good place for people to go if they're interested in the details.
Excellent, thanks. You know, we have a question from the audience that's kind of related to getting started, and this, anybody can jump in, but the question is about, well, so how do you forecast the expected emission reductions when you're setting your carbon price? And, you know, in other words, what's the correlation between the carbon price and the emissions level desired? Do you set the carbon price and then try to figure out what the emissions are going to be, or do you pick your emission reduction required and then see what the price is going to be? How do you relate those two desires, the price and the emission reductions, as you're setting a price? And Jos, maybe you could jump in on that one right off the bat.
Right. I'm more than happy to jump in. What I learned over the 15 years, almost 15 years that we have the EU ETS, is that price expectations matter most. When people, even when the prices were low, of course, it doesn't help when the prices are low, but even when prices were low, people expected in the long term higher prices. And there was no debate about stopping the program altogether. So the expectation was, and with the Paris Agreement and more ambition, people expected higher prices. And when we try to translate that into a price regulation to pump up the prices, that turned out to be impossible because everybody has different expectations. You have the optimists, you have the pessimists, and you have to navigate between all that. But the most important point was that they all expected higher prices in the future. And when we talked, for example, to CEOs, what did change the nature of their approach to climate change, it was simply the start of the ETS. And the start of the ETS had low prices, but it triggered something that as of now, CO2 is no longer free, or you can no longer emit in illimited quantities the amounts of CO2. And so it became a cost factor. And the fact that it became a cost factor triggered the attention of CEOs, and they changed their behavior. They recruited energy and climate engineers to look at their production processes, how to improve them. But that psychological factor, CO2 is no longer free and over time is going to become more expensive, was the key driver for what we succeeded to do in Europe, namely that over less than 15 years, we almost reduced our emissions with 30%.
And you've always met your targets, right, Jos?
Yes, well, in fact, our system is quantity based. So the overall target, say for 2030, the overall total amount of emissions allowed for those covered by the system is enshrined to the law. So that target is always delivered, and that is how we could buy in the environmental community. There is certainty about the delivery of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that is why we were bothering as a policymaker a little bit less about the price levels, because after all, it is bringing down the emissions, the quantities of emissions that matters the most. And that is why the environmental NGOs continue to support the system, even if they were a little bit unhappy that the prices were too low for a too long time. Now that phase has come to an end, prices are again at what they in a minimum should be as a level to deliver the Paris Agreement goals. So that story has been faded away, but a new one is coming. And that is the competitiveness concerns, because as we move to the high price range, another part of the policy conversation that we are having is with those covered economies who are in international and global markets, and they feel the competitiveness pressure. So the debate has been shifting about, complaining about too low prices. Now that we have higher prices, the concerns about competitiveness are rising again. And that is why it is so important that the world at large can move on carbon prices, because if you are an island of carbon prices, it's going to be damn difficult to continue with the program.
Yeah, and I think the issue of durability, predictability, and even clarity about what the future is going to yield in terms of a policy approach in the EU it has to have helped give investors certainty. So, but let me turn to Henk. How did South Africa pick the price level for your carbon tax? Did they look at the emissions they wanted to achieve, or how did they get to that number?
Well, to be honest, although I can't be for sure, I wasn't involved, but I think it was mainly derived from sort of a little bit of international input. That's 120 Rand at that stage, that was around 10 euros. That would be a reasonable starting point. So I don't think there was any sort of deep underlying analysis of what the impact would be on the actual emission profile. But what we've seen in our business over the last couple of weeks is that, as indicated, maybe it's not even so much the price at this moment in time, but more the fact that there is now a pricing mechanism, and the expectation is that emitting greenhouse gases is just going to become more and more expensive. I mean, at this moment in time, although the headline rate is 120 Rand per ton, with all these discounts applied, the effective tax rate is around 36 Rands per ton. That is just under $3. That is not a very strong price signal. irrespective of that, we have had a huge uptake in interest from the private sector on two aspects. One, how much emissions do we actually have as an entity, and what kind of activities can we undertake to reduce those on the one side, and on the other side, an influx of project developers who say, look, I've been trying to develop this kind of a mitigation activity or this kind of mitigation activity. How can I link this to this carbon price? So I don't think there was a deep thought about setting the initial price level. Government has indicated that over time they will see how it goes and adjust accordingly. But the market has responded irrespective of the price level, I think.
Amazing once you put a price on greenhouse gas pollution that people start thinking and measuring and managing, because of course you don't manage what you're not measuring. So I this, again, a big fan here. But you know, there's a lot of folks who are not such big fans of carbon pricing. And so Tom, I'm going to ask you about this, because you mentioned this, the importance of stakeholder engagement. And this is a question that's, again, coming from the audience. There's, in the US, and I suspect maybe elsewhere, there are some grassroots groups who are opposed to carbon pricing, not because of the greenhouse gases per se, but because of the other pollution that, like here in the US we call it criteria pollution. So if you reduce greenhouse gas emissions on site, then you get those extra benefits of reducing those other pollutants. But if you give companies the flexibility of paying or buying allowances from someplace else, carbon markets and trading, you might not get those extra those extra pollution benefits. So we have some, other groups. We have groups in the US who are opposed to carbon pricing because of this concern that these other kinds of pollution are not going to be reduced. Have you guys, I mean, Tom, have you run into that issue, and when you've gone out for the Partnership of Market Readiness, or have you heard that issue elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So my experience with this has primarily been in California, actually before I was at the bank, but working on carbon pricing still there. So yeah, it's certainly a concern. We're actually working on an executive brief right now on carbon pricing and air quality. And one of the key messages is making sure when you look at climate policy, specifically carbon pricing, you're also determining how you can combine it with air quality policies and proposals to make sure you're offsetting some of these impacts. So I think similar to competitiveness, there's certainly the possibility that this is possible if you have hotspots being created or anything like that. But there's also policy changes you can make or specific proposals you can put in place to make sure these impacts aren't occurring. So I think it's certainly a conversation. I think it goes back to the larger conversation about having a comprehensive policy approach, right? So carbon pricing can't be looked at a vacuum for this reason, but for a number of other reasons. But at the end of the day, you are forcing polluters to put a price on pollution, as opposed to regulations that potentially aren't stringent enough to get emissions to zero. So you're actually, in the carbon pricing aspect of it, putting a price throughout the process, right? Not just to a certain threshold to pay for your own pollution. So I'd actually argue you're doing more to make sure you're reducing those emissions. It might be interesting to turn to Jos and hear what the EU has been doing on this. I think I don't know off the top of my head, so that would be an interesting case study to look at, because I'm sure it's come up there as well.
Absolutely. Jos, what have you heard on this particular topic?
Well, in fact, we did have less of the debate on other environmental issues such as air quality, because the air quality legislation existed basically before we started with climate policy. And so there are targets and legislation set in a completely different manner. And so people do know, companies do know, or urban authorities do know that what they do on air quality or what they do on climate change are different things. Now, if they do it wisely, they may have benefits between the two areas. If you save energy, then you are not only reducing the carbon emissions, but also the air quality problems related to, in particular, when the energy comes from a polluting source, you may also sort out that problem. But we leave that basically to the economic operator, to the company, to the consumer themselves to decide in that area. What was important for us from the company perspective was technological neutrality. That was a big debate. In fact, our companies hated the perspective that for the sake of climate change, we would prescribe to them what kind of technology they have to use. That you would come in and say, coal is absolutely forbidden, or gas is forbidden, or this sort of that sort of gas is forbidden, unless you go for carbon capture and storage, etc. So that freedom, that technological neutrality is a basic thing in our legislation. And we say, if the carbon emissions, the CO2 emissions are turned down to the obligations you have under the law, that's fine with us. We do not question with which technology you reached that objective. So for companies, technological neutrality, and they come up with very different solutions. We see, for example, today, if you look at a country, a very important country like Poland, that has a real problem at hand because 75% of electricity is generated through power and lignite. So the energy companies are facing the constraint of the ETS. That means that the economic viability of coal and lignite has gone down significantly. And now they are closing their worst installations first, which is economically rational. And those more enlightened companies are investing now straight into renewable energy. So there are different solutions that different companies are making, but they are all subject to the same carbon price. And either you reduce your emissions or you have to pay the bill. And the bill can be relatively important, in particular if you are in dirty ways of or polluting ways of production of your electricity or your product.
Interesting, and a very good answer.
Can I actually just add one more thing there too?
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so I think it's important because you actually, outside of the US, when you look at carbon pricing systems, and this comes from the communication guide, you've actually seen examples of countries advocating for a carbon price on the question of air quality, right? So if this is the most salient public issue when it comes to environmental issues, perhaps you're advocating for a carbon tax or maybe an indirect fuel tax or something of that sort, simply because of air pollution. So actually, when you kind of step out of a certain bubble, you actually have the opposite effect where carbon pricing is seen as the solution to improving air quality and some of these other pollutants as well. So it's interesting to kind of look at some of the other examples around the world as far as how carbon pricing has been communicated beyond just climate action.
Yeah, and I was quite impressed how, in California redid their target and reauthorized their program. There was pushback on whether to have a carbon price, but in the end, what they did was they put a new program, a sister program in place to deal with SOx, as well as reauthorizing the greenhouse gas rules and the trading program. So I think they heard that message and did it in a very smart way, in my opinion, anyway.
If I may come in, Janet,
oh yeah,
what I forgot to mention, of course, is that there are significant revenues created through the carbon market. And some member states are using these revenues to pay for the measures to improve air quality, for example, or to pay for even air pollution, or even they use the money in some cases to buy areas to maintain biodiversity. So when it is climate / sustainable / environmentally friendly related, then they can use the revenues according to the wishes of the population they want to convince to approve of the actions under the carbon market. So the use of revenues is particularly important to facilitate other related environmental actions to be achieved. A classic is a tax incentive or a subsidy for electric vehicles. There is a pot of money created through the ETS, and that pot of money could be used by some regions or nations to incentivize the take-up of the electric vehicle, which is then leading to both results, carbon as well as air quality. So use of revenues is an important one.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Great.
Jen, sorry
Go
for
ahead,
interrupting
Tom.
one
No,
more
go ahead.
time. And I wanted to give an example on a place that's actually done these simultaneous policies. So in Chile, when they adopted their carbon tax, they actually had parallel carbon taxes, both on carbon, but also specific local air pollutants. And in the areas that are highly polluted, so for example, if you have a hot spot of pollution, they actually apply a higher carbon tax in that area to the local pollutants. So you're not only having the climate benefits, but actually specifically a tax placed on those other pollutants to increase benefits in that regard too. So I think that's an interesting case study that people could look at if they're more interested in that.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for pointing that out. You know, you bring up a good point, Tom, when you mentioned that there's, you know, you can price it differently in different places, but it brought a question jumped in my mind, and it's actually kind of reflected in one of the questions that we just received about how do you know, dealing with unintended consequences, right? Making sure that your policies are complementary and not conflicting. So for example, in the EU, you know, there's a big push to electrify transportation. Well, of course, now if you're pushing more electricity, you know, they're going to pay a higher price because of the CO2 price on carbon for the electricity sector. So how does the EU ETS just treat these expected increases from electrifying transportation? And I also, in the same breath, I want to ask you, Henk, about the relationship between electric vehicles and the carbon tax there in South Africa.
Well, that's a very interesting question because, in fact, in Europe, the EU ETS covers power and manufacturing, not transport. Transport is taxed differently. There is a high energy tax I explained before when at the pump. So when people drive electric vehicles, in fact, they bring the emissions under the ETS and they leave the taxation field. And that is going to create a problem in the future for the tax authorities because they are not having sufficient revenues as they hoped for from the taxation of the fuels compared to what is happening under the ETS. And so for the ETS in our legislation, we stipulated in the legislation by 2030, we have the objective of 43% based on 2005, so that many tons are allowed under the EU ETS. And whether more or less users are coming in, it doesn't matter. It will reflect ultimately on the price. And that is what I wanted to react on what you just said, Janet and Tom. Differentiation of prices works with taxes. You can have tax differentiation. But in the EU, you cannot have price differentiation because we have an ETS. And all over Europe, the carbon price is the same. Whether you are in Germany or in Poland or in Malta or in the north of Sweden, the carbon price is exactly the same. Today, it was 29.6 euros per ton, and that was the carbon price. That's it. So there is no differentiation possible. You have to do it under the revenues, as I explained it, and when on transport more emissions are going to fall under the electric system, under power generation, then ultimately over time prices will go up. But that will be presumably after 2030 rather than before, and the target has been set only for 2030. So that will come into the debate about setting the post-2030 target in view of the decarbonization of Europe by 2050.
Hey, and before I go to Henk on this question, we had another follow-up to this, Jos. You know, there's several European countries that are talking about banning and have banned the internal combustion engine. And so you ban that, you push more electric vehicles. Is there any potential for that to undermine the price stability or increase volatility in the EU ETS market?
Well, the banning is with very different price time ranges. So the earliest ones are 2030. So that is before the target on the ETS that is now set for 2030 is being delivered. But the most time targets are 2035, 2040, and that is only for new vehicles. So given the transition from the electric to away from the conventional engine to the electric vehicle, that will take us 10, 15, 20 years of time before the conventional engine ceases to exist and ceases to be used in the European fabric. But it's an intriguing question because there are optimists and pessimists about the range of new electric vehicles being sold on the European market. We expect it in the Commission between 25 and 35% by 2025. Our car manufacturers have been relatively slow to adapt to that, so that may be an optimistic figure, but time will tell. But the important thing is that the more electric vehicles are being sold, the more they fall under the ETS, but the the quantity target for 2030 is not going to be changed. Now, that has to be coupled with the dramatic increase of renewable energy. In fact, we reckon that by 2030, 1 kilowatt hour in two is going to be produced in a renewable manner. And renewables is mostly wind, hydro, of course, but wind and solar. And that means no carbon emissions. So the electrification of the transport sector goes very well in line with the very rapid growth of renewable energy in Europe.
Excellent. And now let's go back to that question I asked of you, Henk, about these competing tensions, if you will, with, I mean, all countries have different goals, right? We want to protect our domestic industries. We want to encourage, you know, this technology or that technology. But has South Africa kind of, I mean, what's the relationship with the tax and electric vehicles there in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Well, interesting to know, it wasn't a big news item, but on the same day that the carbon tax came into force on the 1st of June, there was also a carbon levy introduced on both diesel and petrol at the pump of 9 rand cents per liter, which is completely separate from the carbon tax for large emitters we're talking about here. If we talk about electric vehicles in South Africa, I would say two main, well, concerns to take into account. One, the electricity grid, the fuel mix is so heavily geared towards being coal-based. 80 to 90% of electricity generation in South Africa is from the combustion of coal. And South Africa's electricity grid has been under a lot of pressure recently. New coal-fired stations have been built. They're not performing according to expectations. They come online too late, and therefore there's been quite a few rolling blackouts throughout the country. So that means two things. If you would actively start a program of converting to electric cars, your demand on the already overstretched electricity grid goes up, and you're basically moving the emissions from your car to the emissions from the electricity grid, since it's completely coal-based. So at this moment in time, electric vehicles are a good solution in South Africa when it comes to local air pollutants, especially in the urban areas and in city centers. But from a climate change point of view, it's not actually a mitigation measure because of the carbon intensity of the grid. Having said that, there is a small caveat. Different from most other places in the world, petrol is made in South Africa from coal. So that process in itself is also extremely carbon intensive. So even though you would assume that an electric car running on a coal-based electricity grid doesn't really help a lot from a climate change point of view, because you're displacing coal-based petrol and diesel, you actually do have a small gain, although a lot smaller than you would have if you have a more renewable fuel mix for your electricity grid. So I think in South Africa, the next step would be a rapidly increasing of the renewable share for the electricity grids before electric cars become a viable mitigation measure.
Hank, you raised a really good point. It's not the same policies everywhere that matter. I think that's a really important point to bring home, that how you produce oil in South Africa makes the oil not. I mean, it definitely changes the carbon value in the long, the life cycle. So that's a great point. It's not the same policies everywhere that really matter. But let me just allow all of you to say just a quick closing remark before we close this up. Tom, do you want to start? Or Jos? Or Hank? Anybody?
Sorry, I was having trouble with my unmuting device there. But
No worries.
yeah, just to close, I mean, highly recommend checking out the report if you want to see any of the details. Anyone, feel free to reach out to me directly if you're interested in anything we talked about. But basically, the state of play right now is we have a lot of experience with carbon pricing systems, a lot we can learn from. We just need to continue with the advocacy and continue the political push to make sure we reach these ambitious goals we have. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the panelists and C2ES, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with all of you on this important cause. So thank you.
Jos?
Well, thank you. And I would like to take up what you just said, Janet, that the same policies may work out in different ways compared to the realities of the country, the status of the power sector, etc., etc. We in Europe, we have run out of energy. And so energy efficiency and saving energy is very high on the agenda. And investing on renewable energy is even higher on the agenda because we are importing most of our energy in the south. And the Middle East is in flames. We are importing a lot of gas from Russia in the east. And you know how difficult it is to have good relations with Russia, although the trade was never distorted, but still. And I think that marks a lot about the connection in Europe between energy conservation, energy efficiency, renewables, and climate policy. And I think there is a rationale there. In Europe, we pay on average every day 1 billion euros for the import of energy goods and services. And so saving 10, 20, 30% on that big invoice every day pays off. And so for climate change, there is the carbon market idea, but also the realization that we need new energy technology in place that is replacing ultimately coal and lignite, and that's going to be much lower in terms of carbon emissions. And I think that story goes well together. It serves also the air quality objectives and other policy objectives. And I think that in other parts of the world, similar synergies have to be elaborated. And they are different, whether you are in Latin America or in Asia or in Africa. But synergies is what matters in politics, because there is so much attention that politicians want to pay to the agenda we are working on, and you have to be very economic with the use of that scarce good, which is time and of the policy negotiation. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much for having participated in this. Thank you.
And over to you, Henk, for the final word.
Yes. Well, I want to thank the fellow panelists for very interesting discussion, and all the attendees for signing in, and you, Janet, and C2ES for hosting this. Well, yeah, as indicated, the South African carbon tax is sort of the new kid on the block, which, as these things go, will always go with teething problems, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So if there's anybody interested in any additional information that we can provide, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if there are suggestions or comments or research that could help us on the journey to becoming a very efficient and effective pricing system, then we're more than open to any suggestions.
Hey, that was great, and I think we all wish you well, Henk, and I know, I know you'll have no shortage of clients asking for your help on this topic. I just want to thank all of you for being such great speakers on our webinar today. I wish, we could all clap, but it doesn't work like that on a webinar. But I also want to let folks know that the slides and the whole webinar will be recorded. It has been recorded. It'll be on our C2ES YouTube website. And stay tuned, August 21st from 1 to 2:30. We're going to have our next webinar, and it's going to be on engaging stakeholders, a topic that Tom brought up. So the next one is on engaging stakeholders on climate risk and opportunities, August 21st, 1 to 2:30. Look forward to having you all join us then, and until then, have a great rest of your week. Take care now.